Order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee, all part of our review into house building and planning and the planning framework. Delighted to be joined by our first panel. I'll just ask the panel to introduce themselves and their organisations, and then we'll get into the questions. So if we could start with you, Ms Postlethwaite, please.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Postlethwaite. I'm a planning ecologist at Northamptonshire Council. So I've worked as a local authority ecologist for 22 years. I'm a co-author of the Wild Justice report Lost Nature, which looked at planning enforcement issues, and I sit on the Planning for Nature Advisory Board.
Excellent, thank you. Dr Boulton.
Dr Iain Boulton. I work for the London Borough of Lambeth, but I'm here as the Vice Chair of the Association of Local Government Ecologists. We represent over 160 local planning authorities across the 4 countries. And I've been Vice Chair for about 15 years and local government for 24 years.
Excellent, thank you. Dr Martin.
John Martin from University of Plymouth, researcher looking at landscape assessment and monitoring, co-chair of the South Devon AONB, or National Landscapes as they're called now, and member of the Tamar Valley National Landscapes, and worked on a number of European projects looking at redevelopment rural regeneration.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms Postlethwaite, if I could start with you. How do you perceive the relationship between the government's house building target and the requirement for local nature recovery strategies to be established?
I'm going to have to pass on this one because I have no experience of LNRS myself, I'm afraid.
Okay. Dr Bolt.
I'm involved with the Greater London Local Nature Recovery Strategy, which covers all of the boroughs of Greater London. And I think, as you might appreciate, in Greater London, the pressures on housing provision are enormous, are phenomenal. But I think it's because we're fortunate to have an integration with the Mayor of London's strategy on housing and environment, quite closely connected and quite closely linked. We appreciate the need for housing to be built, but it's about making sure that nature recovery is integrated into that housing provision rather than being dropped on it, than both of them being dropped on it. There are some amazing sites across London for nature and nature recovery, but it's also about making sure that people are fitted around that nature recovery and vice versa. And I think it's making sure that the organisations driving forward housing development are also talking very closely to those responsible for nature recovery and nature conservation. So I'm speaking obviously from a London-centric view, but I know from some of our members, they have the same position as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you kind of hit to the heart of one of the big questions and trade-offs here. Is it that people fit around nature recovery, or that nature recovery fits around people? Would you care to comment about whether the government's approach changes the balance in terms of whether people are fitting around nature or nature's fitting around people?
I think the risk is, because we know, and I speak for a local authority where our housing needs are unbelievably massive, the need is that you don't forget nature. I mean, politically it's quite important to build houses and houses for the right purposes, but people also need to have access to nature for the quality of their lives, their well-being, both mental and physical. And I think it's about making sure that top-down government needs to be setting policy and strategy that local authorities and local planning authorities can follow, with that balance being taken very carefully all the way through down to the bottom level. Government's role should be to make sure that that direction is clear and it provides for that balance.
Okay, thank you. Dr Martin, how do you perceive the relationship between that house building target, which has changed the areas that in many ways across the country will be expected to increase their numbers, and the requirement for the local nature recovery strategies?
Yeah, so I think, as you were just saying, in terms of it's that key element of having the right development in the right place and working closely with those environmental issues, so it's truly a sustainable development, understanding the consequences of that development, making sure the infrastructure's in place in terms of, especially in the southwest, if you think about the wastewater infrastructure there, if you're increasing the number of houses, that's only going to put more pressure on that infrastructure, which will then lead to polluting rivers and polluting seas. So it's essential to have that connection and think of it as sustainable. Again, that link with people and place, and having that sense of place and make sure the development's in the correct place and meeting the needs of the communities. Connecting also with the protected landscapes. If you think of somewhere like Devon in Cornwall, there's a huge number of protected landscapes. So again, the development of those landscapes have consequences for those landscapes themselves. So it's important to think about that. I think the protected landscapes as a family are not blocking development. I think they want to work closely with these plans and with local authorities to aid development in the right place. So I think that's the key relationship between the two there.
And when you say in the right place, I mean, previous house building growth has, largely centred around London, the South East, and other sort of specific areas. This government's approach seems to be much more about growth in areas that haven't seen that growth. When you're talking about the right areas, is this more complicated than just sort of urban versus rural? And do you see that this government's approach is different to one that's been taken before in terms of what those right areas might be? I
think it's not black and white between urban versus rural. I think there's shades of grey there in terms of how that might work. It's also that affordability of those houses and where they are. If you take again somewhere like Cornwall, in terms of the gentrification of some of those areas where houses have been built, that then leaves those communities gone in terms of there's no one living in those particular areas, so there's no facilities, schools and those types of things. So there's a whole consequences of where that development takes place, and the type of development is super important.
And Dr. Boulton, the changes which the ministers have made to the National Planning Policy Framework, do they make it more likely to enhance or to obstruct the creation, implementation and maintenance of local nature recovery schemes, do you think?
I'm not fully conversant with the NPPF as it's been changing, but I think there are potential risks that it could make it more difficult if there's additional layers being asked of local planning authorities to develop nature recovery, and they're then in conflict with the need for housing. So I think it is about making sure right through the NPPF, there is that need to recognise the need for nature around people is critical for the quality of their lives. But the need for housing needs to be sensitive to nature, including integrating nature into the development itself. We always think about nature around a development, but actually there's many good examples right across the UK where development has integrated nature into itself, and it's worked really well. And also the management of that nature is of a higher standard because people are actually standing on top of it. They can actually manage it.
Yeah. And Ms. Postlethwaite, from a Northamptonshire perspective, do you believe that the changes coming from government will make your local nature recovery schemes easier or more difficult?
I can't really comment for sure because I say I'm not involved. I've only been at Northamptonshire since November, but I would guess due to the increase in housing allocations, it's going to make it more difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Boulton, how well do you think stakeholders such as planners, developers and ecologists are working together to create and implement local nature recovery strategies?
It's highly variable across local planning authorities. I think part of the problem is, though, that many local authorities have a good cohort of planners. It's often that many local authorities do not have a permanent ecologist working for their authority. Don't get me wrong, some local authorities, what they do is they form a combined authority where they share ecological knowledge. Greater Manchester is a good example. But also, if it's a district council, they may struggle to have an ecologist on their books. It may be then they have to work with the county council or unitary authority to provide that provision. Planning officers tend to be better spread across local planning authorities because these are statutory obligations to the council. And I think they've recognised that. I speak for myself in London. I think there is a good relationship between planning officers and ecologists because London is well provided with ecologists. But if you go to other parts of the countries, I think that is highly variable.
Yeah.
And I think the recent reductions in spending and the recent challenges that councils have in terms of providing for homeless and for people in need of housing has meant obviously ecologists don't come very high on the rank in terms of recruiting new staff.
And when you say recent, I mean, you're talking about the last few years or last few months?
I think it's going back almost, even 14 years. It's been through ups and downs because obviously suddenly something comes along that pressurises the need for ecologists, but then of course after the slack comes in, it can be very hard to recruit new people. After COVID, a lot of people retired as ecologists and they have not been recruited in some local authorities.
Yes. When you say recently, I mean, as we've seen local government funds cut over, that sort of last decade and a half, then it's had an impact on this. And do you get any sense that government recognise that if they're going to build the housing that they're going to build, and they're going to do it in a way that continues to protect the environment, that there is going to be a need to make sure there are more ecologists recruited by local authorities, because this is something we've heard a lot.
Yeah.
Do you get a sense that government have kind of thought that through?
I think I get the sense from some of our members who talk to their own members of Parliament that members of Parliament do recognise that, because obviously that is something constituents are asking members of Parliament, because constituents are concerned about the risk of development harming nature and green space. So I think local authorities recognise there is a need for ecologists, and it's then recruiting the cohort. Organisations like CIEM, who we represent here today, and other organisations are doing an awful lot to advocate for more ecologists as well. So it's not just ALGE, it's across the board we're advocating for ecologists. Yeah.
And are there any particularly effective approaches that you've seen to the development of these local nature recovery strategies?
I think I'll speak for the big urban conurbations, because that's the ones I know. I'm thinking of Manchester, I'm thinking of Bristol, I'm thinking of Greater Manchester and London, where I think because they've got the kind of the spread across local authorities and a spectrum of officers, there's been some very successful working up the local nature recovery strategy from scratch and making sure all the right stakeholders are involved, not just local authorities but also private landowners as well. Yeah.
And Postlethwaite, just give us a perspective from a kind of a sort of city area. How large is Northamptonshire in terms of its population, and can you reflect on how that is for you?
I don't know how many people live in that area. It comprises 4 former districts, so there's 4 urban centres. But I couldn't give you a figure for the population, I'm afraid.
No, sure. And I mean, in terms of your authority, do you feel that you've got the sort of ecologist support that you would need?
No, I mean, they're in a better situation now than they have been for quite a while, but literally they have 2 agency staff as ecologists and the county council ecologist, and that's it.
Yes. Yeah. I should say there's many people in the political scene that spent a lot of time in Northamptonshire when there was a recent by-election there, so we might know it rather better than we would most areas, but thank you. Anna Geldard.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome panel. What are the main indicators for the effectiveness of a local nature recovery strategy? And I'll come to Dr. Martin first.
I think, I'm not sure this answers the question, but I think one of the key issues, and maybe back to the other question, is in terms of the sets of data and having consistent data. And again, that's linked to not having enough ecologists, but that's linked to also data not necessarily being up to date or shared, and having top-down and bottom-up data. So developers will produce data, but that may not necessarily be shared or is shared at a cost. There's also a lot of really good local projects going on, citizen science projects going on, collecting data around some of these issues, but there's no mechanism for that to find its way back to a data set. So I think a call really for a sort of observatory around this, where data from bottom up and top down is collected and is available via a platform, a national platform, and is consistently up to date and can be used at no cost. Would be a major step forward in terms of pushing this sort of thing.
And I'll come in there and say one of the great tools to making LS work and work effectively and collect data is our local record centres. Across the UK, often counties at one time had record centres who collated data on ecology, open spaces as well, trees included, and were then able to share that with local planning authorities and stakeholders in the community as well, to ensure there was a good data set to allow them to make decisions. Local record centres, like a lot of local authorities, went through changes and pressures because often local record centres are funded through local government. And so obviously if money's tight, it can be hard to finance the local record centres, and they may struggle to then have that staffing to service the needs of data and intelligent information. So I think record centres are critical, and we're very lucky across the UK. We do have a very good cohort of record centres, but they, like local planning authorities, struggle as well to have the resources to make sure they can serve their customers' needs.
Sarah Postlethwaite, did you have anything to add about effective indicators? No. Thank you so much. So we've heard there about the challenges for good record centres and the funding for that. I was wondering if there was any further challenges that you'd like to highlight to the committee around those challenges that may prevent an effective local nature recovery scheme from being effective.
I think it's also to recognise the fact that not all land is in public ownership. A lot of land is in private ownership, or it's owned by commercial enterprises, including utilities providers. And I think LNRS's work if all the right stakeholders are involved from the very beginning. And that includes the private landowners. I'm not saying that you're going to suddenly build a new woodland on somebody's private land in their back gardens. But it's about saying that if you own land and you're a private entity, you are involved and you're informed, and then you may offer land available for nature recovery. And I think of some of the water companies, we were discussing before we came in about water companies, they often have huge land holdings which are prime for nature recovery. And you'd think in the current climate, the water companies would be looking for opportunities to look good in the public eye. And I think it's also about also the non-government bodies as well who have land as well. And I think it's making sure that they're part of the process. And I think that's the success story. It's not all about public bodies. It's about everybody, because nature recovery is for everybody. And particularly in the countryside, a lot of land is in private ownership, and I think it's making sure that those private landowners are informed, involved from the very start. And that's often where members of Parliament actually play a key role, because you can advocate that when you're talking to your constituents.
Absolutely.
I think there, and those protected landscapes that you find in those areas can play a key role in terms of bringing those stakeholders together. There's often very good relationships there that exist already. But again, there's an issue of funding within, as you're probably all aware, around national parks and national landscapes. But they can play a role in bringing these almost matrix management of
Before we go to the next question, I'll give an example. Greenham Common in West Berkshire. There, of course, it used to be the old airfield. If you go to Greenham Common now, it is one of the most impressive green spaces in terms of biodiversity and nature. Nature has recovered. And what was a site that was also potentially very controversial, but is now seen as a flagship for nature recovery.
Very helpful. Always good to hear examples and success stories. How sufficient is current government guidance for measuring the effectiveness?
I think it could be better focused, it could be more concise, it could be clearer. It's not helped by this constant changes of guidance and new policy coming through all the time. I think it's just a review of all the kind of guidance about data collection and data management. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, very interesting. Is there a specific example you'd like to highlight of one of the areas that could be clearer?
I think it's about the fact that there are certain critical data sets, for instance, about our ancient woodland inventories, our veteran tree inventories. There's been a lot of different guidance about how you measure the quality and the value of our woodlands, and particularly our older woodlands. And I think just refining some of the guidance would help as well, because I think we all appreciate woodlands and we value it very highly for what it contributes to our society. But it's about how you evaluate it, how you measure it, how you quantify it. A lot of people out there in the field are doing an immense amount of work, but I think it's about just making that a bit easier to understand how you, and that's particularly citizens as well.
Yeah.
And
I think I was also going to say, I think also other initiatives that run alongside often cause confusion, and people then trying to do more than one thing, and the indicators aren't necessarily there. They do a piece of work for a couple of years, then the funding stops, they move on to something else. So you'd never have a complete data set around some of these things. So it's that consistent longitudinal data that's also needed to be captured to show the effectiveness.
You've looked ahead to my next question, because we heard a lot about data gaps that are hindering some of the development and the functioning of these strategies, which we've heard that you found has been an issue. Are there specific types of data that are not available? And do you see any prospects for seeing that data improved that you'd like to highlight for us?
Varies from particular topic or issue. But one of the things I think has come out recently, has been in the news, of course, is about the sudden decline of invertebrates and pollinators across the UK. And we now realise that we are losing an entire cohort of experts on surveying for invertebrates. Those people who collected all the records of the era of Charles Darwin, are not there anymore and are retired or have passed away, and there's no cohort recruitment of those experts to survey, because we do know that our invertebrates and pollinators, their populations are struggling, and yet they're so critical for making nature recovery work.
Anything to add from anyone else on the panel on that point?
No, I think it's just identifying the key set of data that you want to use and make sure it's consistent and it's being collected. And that's the
Thank you for
vital
that.
point.
And so finally, how sufficient are the current funding, resource and capacity mechanisms for supporting the development and implementation of these schemes?
It varies across the country. But I think we're very fortunate that DEFRA, for instance, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has been very supportive in terms of getting ready for biodiversity net gain. It's given us some starter funds which have been very well appreciated by local planning authorities. But again, it's come in local nature recovery strategies. It's really down to the partners of that LRS to find the resources, because local planning authorities may often struggle to find the money themselves unless they can pool their resources to make it more effective. And that's why I go back to about the private landowners and other organisations contributing to an LRS which works effectively. Yeah.
Helpful. Anyone? No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. I actually have some questions on biodiversity net gain. So my opening question, and perhaps we start with yourself, Ms. Postlethwaite. How easy or difficult are biodiversity net gain schemes to implement and manage?
Well, a biodiversity net gain scheme is something that starts literally like project conception and finishes 30 years post-development completion. So from a local authority point of view, we see it at the moment, because it's only a year into the process, just while we're reviewing applications. There's no B&G developments that have been built out yet that require monitoring. So I can only give my experience of what I've seen within the planning system so far. And that's generally that you have a large proportion of smaller residential schemes using loophole, the self-build loophole, to claim exemption from B&G, and I'm not sure in most cases how sort of strictly this is being enforced, because I've certainly seen applications from medium-sized developers claiming this is self-build. So but it's not my job to comment on that. The other thing I'm seeing is problems caused by, in the guidance and legislation, there's kind of a lot of grey areas. And we need a lot more clarification on things, say, such as the issue of what is significant. So significant B&G is what has to be secured for 30 years. The rest can just be kind of left to a planning condition and doesn't have to be monitored. But really, what is significant is a hugely contentious issue at the moment, because it can have potentially quite big cost implications for developers. So, and the other thing is the quality of landscape schemes as well. So this is because they're basically trying to propose quite complex habitat creation on site, because it's cheaper to provide it on site than go off site. So there's issues as well with the quality of the work in terms of the information submitted. The baselines are often incorrect.
Thank you very much. Dr. Boulton, do you have anything to...
I'd reiterate what Sarah said.
Yep.
But the thing also as well is that, don't get me wrong, we've seen some B&G gain plans come through recently which have been done really well by some developers and their agents, because they've thought from square one how to do it properly and to avoid some of the pitfalls that Sarah's mentioned. And I think, again, it's about ensuring that developers are also receiving good guidance and good advice as well, because a lot of the guidance is coming to local planning authorities about B&G. But I think also it's about making sure that developers and their land managers are getting also good quality guidance about what local planning authorities are expecting to see, and about how to actually make sure B&G works for them, so that we don't end up with these problems.
And Dr. Martin, anything to add? No. So some developers are choosing to fulfil their biodiversity net gain obligations by funding off-site. How confident are you that arrangements for monitoring and regulation at off-site locations are robust, reflecting its early days?
Off-site or on-site?
Off-site.
Can't really comment on that.
If you want to comment on on-site, that would also be helpful.
Yeah, because local authorities only need to get involved in monitoring on-site net gain, or if they are a responsible body, so monitoring what's being provided via habitat banks, essentially. So, again, we're not really at the stage of monitoring any developments. So, all I can say, we can get an indication of what's likely to happen. So this is from basically the work that we did for the Wild Justice Report, Lost Nature, last year, looking at developments that have already been built and how compliant they were with the habitats that they should have been providing on site. So overall, they failed to provide 47% of the habitats that they should have. And when it came to grassland, which is a commonly proposed ecological enhancement in order to get net gain on site, this fell to 59%. So unless we can get secure monies for monitoring, this is what we're likely to see. And the problem is, for smaller sites which aren't getting Section 106 to secure monitoring monies, that's a burden that falls to the LPA for 30 years. And yeah, so that's one issue. The other issue is enforcement, actually, because enforcement teams are already generally quite under-resourced. So that's why this is happening, because it's not being monitored, but also really they're quite powerless to take any action enforcement-wise. So, for example, Northamptonshire, 4 former districts, 1 enforcement officer.
Right.
And the other issue is unfeasible habitat creation proposals, because they're trying to squash stuff in on site, will make these schemes less likely to succeed. Yes. So that will lead to problems with enforcement, because no amount of enforcement is going to get certain habitats to happen if the conditions aren't right, essentially. So that's going to be a bit of a headache. And also the enforcement process can be dragged out for quite a long time as well. And companies do, so for example, on developments, management of these habitats is subcontracted to,
third parties.
Yeah, third parties, so I can't think of the actual term. But third parties who can easily go bust, essentially, and just start up again if enforcement action was taken against them. So that,
Anything further to add?
No, I agree with that as well. Total agreement with that.
Are there any risks to the scheme's effectiveness in delivering nature recovery? And perhaps this is where Dr. Boulton and Dr. Martin, you may have some observations.
There is a risk, and I think that goes back to what I said earlier about thinking about what you're going to propose at the beginning, is to make sure that if you're going to read what that local nature recovery strategy is for the area which your development's in, and actually cross-matching and saying, if I do this scheme, what elements will actually recover nature? Will it contribute to LNRS or will it not? There's more chance, I think, if you're thinking about LNRS and you've got it right, then that monitoring enforcement might be easy for in the long term, because of course you're sitting in a bigger picture, and that's where possibly the enforcement monitoring might be more effective, because someone's going to come around and check on those schemes because they're part of an LNRS programme.
Anything further, Dr. Martin? No? My final question, do you have any concerns around the monitoring and regulation of biodiversity credit market?
It's something which I'm very new to, but I think again it's not clear exactly how it's going to work in practice. It would be good to have some case examples showing actually how the process will follow, where the pitfalls are, where local planning authorities might intervene or might not have the powers to intervene. It's early doors yet.
Yeah, can I just add something?
Yes, of course.
We need consistent monitoring protocols essentially for this, so that can be applied across the board, because the problem is the habitat classification system that is used for biodiversity net gain, called UK HABS, is a very subjective method compared to the previous habitat classification system that was like the gold standard, called NVC, National Vegetation Classification. So the fact that it's more subjective can leave it more open to abuse. So that's why we need some really consistent monitoring protocols in place.
And if we were looking for recommendations, that would be a key recommendation for you?
Yeah.
Thank you. Pippa Halings.
Just to build on that recommendation, just hearing from you, what would be your recommendation, given you're saying that there is basically, as I understand it, nobody who's responsible for monitoring off-site at the moment? So just to understand that point, and also for it to come in at the beginning, would there be a recommendation about strengthening the duty on local government regarding the local nature recovery strategies? At the moment, it's just to take account of. Should they have material weight? Just your recommendations to the committee on those two.
I think it would be nice to have material weight. It would be nice to have that kind of increased involvement, but also that requires resourcing as well. You know, that will need someone to do it, and that's a challenge for local planning authorities.
It was just on the off-site.
Yeah, sorry. In terms of off-site, that's monitored by a combination of the companies themselves that set up as habitat banks, so, or as, you know, through a responsible body if they're like smaller habitat banks essentially.
So no further recommendations on that one?
Not really my area of knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you. Julie Buckley.
Yeah, just on the same point, I was quite appalled actually to hear how low the percentage of house builders that are actually delivering these sites. It was really quite a shocking statistic. And you talked a lot about enforcement. What is the penalty if house builders don't deliver these sites?
I can't tell you because it's very not clear at the moment what the enforcement will be. I've not had any examples in my local planning authority of any enforcement having to be done. And again, it is tricky to get enforcement on a wide range of planning infringements as well. And I'm not familiar with what the penalties will be.
Yeah, I don't know either, I'm afraid.
Do you think that penalties should be quite clear, and do you think that would help in order to...
Clear, and they need to be quite severe financially, because if there's no consequence, which is effectively the situation at the moment, then why do it?
Do you think that would help compliance?
Yes, it would as well. It doesn't even, it often may not be financial. It could be just actually the physical rectification of what you haven't done.
But having to pay for that.
Yeah, exactly.
The penalty then pays for the resourcing, which you're saying is missing. That's quite a useful recommendation for us.
Yes, it will be for us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Olivia Billing.
Thank you. First question to Ms Postlethwaite, if that's okay. Biodiversity net gain requirements actually making any difference to the way that housing developments are being planned and delivered than previously?
As a local authority ecologist, a bit difficult to say because I'm not involved in the planning or the delivery. So I can say that obviously I've seen landscape schemes change to generally become more complex, sometimes completely wildly ambitious and ridiculous. So in terms of delivery, again, too early to comment really.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that one. I mean, we've seen some biodiversity net gain proposals come through from actually local planning authorities departments, such as housing departments. And some of them actually have been very good because, again, they're talking directly to their local planning ecologists and their planning officers. And they're beginning to understand what they have to do on site, which delivers quality but is not too complicated.
You have. Could you share with us the examples of local authorities? That
I can probably find you some examples. We can ask the ALGE to provide examples to committee members.
Thank you. That would be very kind.
Yeah.
Do you think that's are the changes that have been brought in to introduce biodiversity net gain requirements, are they having an overall impact on the aim of nature recovery? Do you think? Dr. Boulton.
I think B&G is not the be-all and end-all of nature recovery. I think biodiversity net gain is a great tool, but I think there's more to it than that. I think nature recovery involves more than just biodiversity net gain. It involves also a wider range of projects. Because you know, some developments are not eligible, do not have to provide B&G, but they can still think about nature recovery as part of their planning application. And then they can integrate it. And I've seen some small-scale developments come through which have not required B&G, which have actually put in features which will provide towards nature recovery in a part of a borough which is highly commendable and needed.
To you, Dr. Boulton, if that's okay. Previously, we had a witness note that biodiversity net gain means that ecologists are now being consulted on developer designs much earlier in the process. Is this the experience across ecologists working in the field, do you think, at the moment, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
A long way to go, but I'm talking to members before today. There is evidence that they are being involved much earlier, but it is variable. It is variable, and it depends on that relationship with the planning officers, because planning officers might not realise when to trigger that response from an ecologist, and I think it's just making sure they understand when that trigger point arrives.
And under biodiversity net gain, developers need to provide at least 10% of improvements, but previous oral evidence that we've had on this suggested that local authorities were struggling to justify asking for more than that. Is the evidence of local authorities asking for more than 10% in gains available? Do you know if anyone's been asking for more and been successful?
I think,
or
yes,
not?
I think a number of local planning authorities have actually gone for more than 10%, but and I can find the figures for you. But I think it has been a lot of pushbacks. They get a lot of pushbacks to go for more than 10%, because to justify more than 10%, the process of justifying that becomes more complicated, and there's more grounds for challenge from a wider range of stakeholders.
And is there any examples where developers have actually agreed with more than 10% that you're aware of?
I don't think of any examples myself, but I can do some research for the committee.
Brilliant, thank you, that would be very kind. Any other comments on those points? No? Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to turn to the issue of nutrient neutrality. And to begin with Dr. Boulton, just in terms of, are the current measures to prevent nutrient pollution effective? And if so, in what ways?
I'm not an expert on nutrient neutrality, so I'll have to go back and ask committee members, ALGE members if they can provide some information on that one.
Any other one?
Sorry, I can comment on. Thank you.
But I'm sure some of our members would like to comment on that one, so I can get them.
Right. In terms of, I suppose in terms of, could you certainly come back to the committee then in terms of in written form with some of that evidence, and also in terms of the area in general then, could you ask your members in terms of, are there ways in which local authorities, developers, environmental experts can work better together to facilitate more housing development while effectively mitigating in terms of environmental risks from nutrient pollution, in terms of any examples they have of ways in which it might be working, or anything they think could be done?
Yes.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Chris Hinshaw.
Thank you, Chair. So we are aware that 1 in 4 local planning authorities do not have any access to ecological expertise. To Ms. Postlethwaite, to start with, what do you think needs to change to improve the implementation and enforcement of environmental policies alongside the rapid delivery of 1.5 million new homes?
So, sorry, can you just ask that again? Because I'm not entirely sure where this fits with my notes.
Okay, yes. So essentially what I'm asking is, in quite a broad sense, we've talked already today about the lack of ecological expertise within local authorities. I'm asking what more you think needs to be done to improve the implementation and enforcement of environmental policies at the local authority level.
Gosh, okay, that's a lot one. Better resourcing is number one. So, because I mean, there are problems on multiple fronts with this. So there are too few ecologists, and also there are too few ecologists with the right level of knowledge and experience. So that you end up with some LPAs relying on advice from, say, wildlife trusts or agency staff, and that can be highly variable. And in some cases, I've heard them not actually being ecologists or having any experience with ecology, and yet providing ecology advice on applications. So there's that. There's again, the lack of enforcement officers. So again, that means that ecology issues tend to take a bit of a back seat. And also the enforcement officers don't have the knowledge to assess ecological features such as, has the right type of grassland been planted, things like that. So there's also little resource, I think, in many local authorities for biodiversity duty reporting, which is going to be a real issue for BNG. So
that's excellent. Sorry, did someone else want to come in there for a minute?
Same things, I'd agree with that one. And also I think it's you said there are local planning authorities that are ecologists, but often they can work with other authorities who have ecologic experience. And of course we've talked about these combined authorities and shared services. Greater Manchester does it, Merseyside does it as well. And I think it's about them having the realisation that they need that advice, they need that support, and they need to work out mechanisms to access that support. Mm-hmm. Greater Manchester, as an example, has a wealth of knowledgeable ecologists working for the Greater Manchester Authority. It's making sure those authorities tapping into that knowledge. It doesn't require a lot of resources to pay for that service. Right. And that should be advocated. Yeah.
I would just add as well, in terms of not from local authority, but in terms from national landscapes, they can play a role again, as I said. And I think the Levelling Up in the Regeneration Act that is currently, I think the second bit's being redrafted now, that further in the purposes of those protected landscapes, they can support this role as well and have that across, because they sit within local authorities.
And I think that's where combined authority mayors and regional mayors can play a key role. I think if they understand what ecology means to their constituents and to their area, they can play a very important role in advocating for that.
Okay, it might be very interesting to get some further written evidence from you on how you think this links into devolution and local government reorganisation.
We will do.
Ms Postlethwaite, picking up on some of the points that you made, you talked about a lack of the right level of knowledge and expertise. Are there particular fields within ecology that are lacking?
Well, certainly B&G has shown that there's a real lack of botanical skills in the sector.
So that would be an area that you think the government would need to look at for training?
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah.
And you spoke about lack of knowledge of it from enforcement officers, so there's a training issue there as well.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. What more could the government do following on from that then? Could the government do to improve the recruitment and retention of ecologists and environmental experts in local government?
Well, the biggest issue is pay, really. Especially in local authorities, because I think sort of realistic wages for where we are now are being hampered by the job evaluation process and also the grading structure that you get in councils. So, for example, I've just seen this week an advert for a B&G ecologist in South and East Lincolnshire. So they're asking for an understanding of both the legislative and policy framework, as well as the ecological assessment methods, which is UK HABs required to implement B&G. The salary range is 26 to 29,000 a year. So minimum wage is about 23,500. You're not going to get someone with that. That's quite a high level of knowledge that you're asking for and experience. You're not going to get the person with the requisite skills on that salary, and that's the issue.
Okay, so
that's number one.
Yeah.
Two, you've got really high workloads. That leads to mental health problems, stress, burnout. Quite common. A lot of ecologists have left the sector for that reason.
Presumably that in itself is part of the resourcing problem. There's not enough people to share
absolutely.
the workload.
So in consultancy particularly, got a bad work-life balance over the summer when you're doing most of your survey work. Less of an issue in local authority. But then for both, you've got lack of accommodations for neurodiverse staff. I think this is better in local authorities because they have got a bit more flexibility about home working and other things that they can do. But this is an issue, a big issue actually, I think, in retention, because ecology as a profession seems to attract a higher proportion of neurodiverse people than many other industries. So not catering to them means they're losing a lot of potentially good people. So, and also the lack of resource in-house, in local authorities to train up new ecologists is preventing us taking on graduates and training them up because we just don't have the time to do it, essentially. So.
Thank you very much. It might be useful to have some further written detail on some of those points. I'm sure we could talk about it for a long time. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on?
Yes, I mean, I'll support that one because I work for a London local authority where we have 350,000 plus residents, and I'm the only ecologist. So you can imagine the pressures our local authorities under in terms of development for housing included, and I'm having to carry a huge caseload. But also I don't have anybody that I can transfer those skills to. And it's something I'd love to do. And I think if the government can actually look at the way in which we are funding apprenticeships, mentoring schemes as well for people coming out of university or thinking university career, to think of this as a career that actually has enormous traction and benefit for them, that would be something I think we'd all support.
Yeah. My final question then is just whether anyone on the panel would like to comment on whether the recent changes to the NPPF make it less likely that environmental policies will be adequately implemented and enforced at the local authority level.
I think this is really important actually. They will have a huge impact, I think, because in the absence of updated local plans and in the context of increased housing targets, most development that will come forward will be on unallocated sites. So these tend to be the sites that are actually better for nature generally. So yeah, this is potentially a huge issue. So there needs to be better strategic planning that identifies the sites that are least harmful to nature. So we also need to do something to strengthen brownfield protection, because although we appreciate that many are in great locations for redevelopment, and that's fine, But a lot of those sites are also really ecologically valuable, like former quarries and industrial sites. So moving to automatic approvals for brownfield sites could cause some serious issues, I think.
Yes.
And also, lastly, the rise in applications that this is going to lead to, it just compounds the whole workload and capacity issue that we've already mentioned. So,
yeah. Agree with that one as well. I think also to bear in mind, and I'll go back again when I said earlier about sites, is that there are examples of brownfield sites or previous military sites which have been converted partially into housing, very good housing, and yet part of the site has been retained for nature conservation. And one example comes to me is Waltham Abbey, which of course was originally a gunpowder works, and yet part of it is actually provided for housing. And the rest of it is an amazing heritage feature, but also is probably one of the richest wildlife sites of its kind in northeast London.
I'll just add there, so that's what I think in terms of selection of sites, is that sensitivity and capacity, and understanding the sensitivity and capacity of sites and directing developers in that way so that you don't have somewhere that can't cope with it getting applications. I think overnight you would see the applications drop because the developers would put applications into areas where they know there's no help of getting permission, and hopefully direct them in that thing if you map sensitivity and capacity across areas.
Yes.
So can I just drill down a little bit further into that? There's two recommendations there from across the panel on strategic identification of the least sensitive sites. Where do you think the responsibility for that should lie? How do you see that being incorporated into our current ways of working at the local authority level?
Do with the production of local plans, really.
Right.
The problem is they'll now be out of date with the increased housing allocations. But
So
that's the point
should
at which
in the local planning process.
Yeah, exactly.
Development, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or if it's a combined authority, that combined local plan position as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Julia Buckley.
Could I just come back in, if we can go back one question onto the recruitment and retention issue? I'm hearing from quite a few of you that, the problem is around the inadequate resource for a growing demand. And I'm just sort of thinking about my previous career in local government, where if you think about other mandated requirements on developers, the developer is required not only to make a financial contribution, but that they are actually ring-fenced. If you think about CIL, Community Infrastructure Levy, the developer is effectively being taxed to make sure that any changes to highways are absolutely locally spent, and it's ring-fenced for that development, for that area, and the developer is taxed. You could say the same for the Section 106. So do you think there's a space here for some kind of ring-fenced tax on the developer, because this is a legal requirement for them to do BNG? That would then bring in a proportionate amount of funding related to the amount of work for the additional BNG requirements.
That would require extra legal resource, though, and that's again something else that's in short supply within most planning authorities, and that's why many of the smaller developments don't have a Section 106 to secure the BNG, because it would result in an increased delay while they waited to get that produced.
Large developers now have a kind of tick box where they know they're going to have to tick these 3 boxes to get approval, especially to get into a local plan, and so they're just going to tick those boxes because they don't want a delay, because a delay is a cost to a developer. So maybe there's a space there around ring-fenced requirements that are specifically allocated to fund this, because if it's a requirement that we do this work, then there must be a requirement that it is paid for at source.
Yes. Agree. Yeah, I think it also needs a mindset within local authorities as well, because often Section 106 and CIL tends to be focused on capital improvements to sites, and I think it's very hard to then argue within the local authority for a proportion to be revenue funding to pay for somebody. So maybe being more flexible about how that money is then allocated would certainly be very well supported by planning authorities.
And your example of the combined authorities where they perhaps have a pool of people, some of those might be consultants that could be capitalised, but that you also need the option for direct employees. And then just lastly on your point about retention, that through EDI, quality diversity policies, you should be able to get additional support for neurodiverse. If there's any consolation, the work of MPs, this place is also not built for neurodiverse people either. So please keep pushing to support your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin, can I just ask you, the government are focused on brownfield first as their sort of response to achieving these planning targets. We've heard from previous panels that actually many of these brownfield sites may be laid dormant for 15, 20 years, actually quite nature rich, and actually the biodiversity net gain might be a tougher achievement on a brownfield site than it would be on a farmer's field that usually had lamb on it or whatever. So, I mean, can you just tell us, do you see that the government's sort of push to achieve its house building targets on brownfield sites will actually be sort of easier or more difficult from a nature restoration and recovery standpoint?
Yeah, it's quite difficult for you to comment, but I think, it goes back to the point I made in terms of the right place and right development. So I think it will totally depend on the site and the conditions that you're looking at. And again, maybe we talked about that sensitivity capacity surveying that would come in, and you would see those brownfield sites either sit in a red grade or a green grade, depending on the local conditions. So again, I think the importance of collecting that local data and the top-down data and connecting those to the loop gives you the best information to make a decision on those sites.
Yeah. What about yourself, Dr. Boulton? Do you see the sort of brownfield first approach being difficult from a BNG perspective for developers to achieve?
Yeah. There are some brownfield sites which I think organisations like Bug Life and Butterfly Conservation have surveyed and shown they're incredibly ecologically rich sites and therefore challenging to develop without losing that biodiversity interest. But that doesn't mean to say all brownfield sites can't be developed. I think it's about understanding what the brownfield site contains and actually what it contributes to nature recovery, and then seeing whether parts of that site, if not all of it, could actually be redeveloped as well.
Yes, I mean, certainly for some of us in areas like mine in North Derbyshire, you know, I walk past brownfield sites in London that are getting developed like that. Mm-hmm. I look at sites in Chesterfield, been 20 years, and, you know, the economics just don't add up the same. So do you see this leading to a kind of two-tier system where wealthier areas will easily develop brownfield sites, and those, you know, up country, which the government are saying they want to see this housing growth in all kinds of areas that maybe haven't had as much growth in recent years, will find it much more difficult to achieve.
There is that risk as well, and I think that needs to be carefully thought through as well. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Alison Taylor.
Just continuing that theme, is there any reason why a brownfield site with biodiversity introduced through the development process couldn't be put back to the original state in terms of biodiversity following the completion of the development? And would the removal of contamination, for example, from a brownfield site not be seen as a positive in terms of biodiversity?
It all depends on your understanding of the site, because, you know, there are some habitats you can recreate and you can do it, but some types of habitats are hard to recreate very easily, particularly some contaminated land, for instance, might contain woodland, which is growing up over time, which is incredibly rich in nature, and creating new woodland from scratch is now impossible. One of the interesting areas, and it probably relates to Derbyshire, is about railway land. A lot of all former railway land was abandoned because they didn't need the sidings, and yet they were contaminated because of all the materials. But they turned into some of the best woodland habitats we have, and yet rail is under pressure to obviously realise its assets and may want to then release some of that land for development. It's contaminated, it contains woodland. Which one do you do first? And it's about having that whole view of the site and understanding what can we do, what can't we do. In the longer term interest of the residents and the people who live there, we may need housing development on part of the site, but part of the site we can leave behind, and then we can integrate nature into the development, which has its equal ecological value.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Chris Hinchliffe.
Chair, a similar point actually. We've heard some debate during this inquiry around the proposals for grey belt. And I wondered, as ecologists, what your thoughts were on that, because I know I've seen in the press, you know, some debate back and forth about scrubland, it's ugly versus it's biodiverse. Thoughts on that?
Scrub is actually one of the most ecologically valuable habitats there is.
Mm-hmm. So do you have concerns about the concept of scrub being identified as grey belt?
Yes.
Yes. I know of at least 7 or 8 bird species which use scrubland actually as their breeding habitat, and of course, as we all know, all wild birds are protected by law from being disturbed during nesting season.
Thank you. Gardner.
Just very briefly, Dr. Boulton, you mentioned bug life, and I think this committee in a previous life has heard evidence from bug life. in relation to brownfield sites, where specifically it was chemical sites and contaminated chemical sites which actually had some extremely rare and valued biodiversity on it from an invertebrate point of view. How do we go about managing those trade-offs?
It's hard because you can't just stop developing a site which is heavily contaminated because there is a public health issue, there's an environmental health issue for contaminated land, because again it adds to the pollution of our watercourses and our land. I think it's about, is there opportunities to recreate that kind of habitat on an alternative site or in a nearby site, or leave it on part of the site and removing most of the contamination. I do a lot of work in the Netherlands, and we find examples there where they've really gone to town on bioremediating quite a lot of all former industrial sites. It is an upfront cost to the developer, but the long-term benefits is that they're able to develop the site, but also they integrate their nature into the site as well by creating new features part of the landscaping, which to an average insect which is looking for somewhere to rest down, that habitat is just as good. So it needs a little bit of maybe cross-country working to see what they're doing well, and it's not necessarily European Union countries. This could be countries outside the European Union as well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Postlethwaite, Dr. Boulton and Dr. Martin. We have very much appreciated your evidence today, and that brings to a close the first panel. So this sitting is suspended. Order. Order. Well, welcome to the second panel of our session today. I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Kite, Dr. Hills and Neal. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves and your organisations and knowledge in this area?
I'm Ben Kite. I'm here in my capacity as the currently elected chair of the Strategic Policy Panel of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. SIEM represents more than 8,000 ecologists and environmental managers, mainly working in the land use planning system. My day job, though, I'm a consultant ecologist, a director of an ecological consultancy.
I'm reassured, based on what we've heard, that there are 8,000 ecologists in Britain, so that's a positive step.
Local authorities, though. Hello, I'm Victoria Hills. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. I am a chartered town planner, but I've left practice to do this job. We advocate for our 27,000 members globally. Most of them are in the UK and Ireland, growing membership globally. Broadly, half are in the public sector, in local government we've been hearing from, and the other half are in public sector, also academia. We're a charity. We work in the public interest, and we are also a learned society. So when I talk about research, that's very much independently led on behalf of our members.
Thank you very much. Ms. Neal.
Good afternoon, I'm Charlotte Neal. I'm Director of Surveying Practice at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. I'm a Chartered Surveyor myself and, like Victoria, left practice to work at the RICS. We have over 140,000 members globally who work all across the whole life cycle of the natural and built environment, right through from mineral extraction, construction, building surveying, through to the end use of properties. And we are here because we can represent in terms of how we implement and look at the skills gaps and the necessary regulation of professionals across the industry.
Thank you very much. Before we commence our evidence, for just invite my colleague Alison Taylor, I think she had a register of interest she wanted to declare at the start of this panel.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to my register of interest. Before becoming an MP, I was a Chartered Surveyor, but I'm still a Fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors.
Excellent, thank you very much. So if I could start with yourself, Dr. Hills. The government planned to build 1.5 million homes in England over the life of this Parliament. What needs to be in place for this to be achieved without damaging the natural environment and impairing current levels of biodiversity?
So we very much advocate for a plan-led system. We already heard from the last witness that not too many local authorities seem to have an up-to-date local plan these days. The truth is it's closer to about 40% who do. That means 60% do not broadly have an adopted local plan. So the first answer to your question is everything needs to start with a plan. It's got to be plan-led, and if local areas know what they would like to be delivered, then they can work out where best to put it. So one of the ways that you meet everybody's demands, needs, including nature, biodiversity, is to have that very clearly understood, what you already have and where you want to get to, and that needs to start through that statutory plan-making process. We're relatively agnostic if it's at local level or far more strategic. Indeed, we've been advocating for strategic planning with more to come on that. So plan-led is very important, but of course you can have the best plan in the world, but if you've got nobody to help support delivery, then you come a bit unstuck, and we've just been hearing again from some of the earlier witnesses where that can cause tension. So good resourcing of local government at this particular moment in time is essential. There are lots of ecologists, many of them work across sectors. Many of them may not be in local government. Is that necessarily a problem? Well, not necessarily if a local government can buy them in, but they still need budgets to do that. So resourcing is critical, well-resourced planning departments. Our research shows, to an earlier question, that in the previous session, I should say, 50% broadly of local government planning department budgets have disappeared over the last decade. Indeed, our research shows in the last 7 years, we've lost 25% of local authority planners in local government. So it's hardly a wonder when you may hear from other witnesses about delays, Well, if a quarter of your staff are no longer there, then of course you're going to be waiting a little bit longer for some of those answers and permissions. So how do you fix it when times are tight? What we are advocating, and have been for some time, but we'll have another go through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, is for ring-fencing of planning fees. We believe, whilst Treasury's position has always been it's not possible, actually if things are getting quite critical against that backdrop of lack of resources, you do need to have some innovation in fiscal policy to help you solve them. So we will be advocating for ring-fencing planning fees so that when developers pay for services and the business of development, including ecology and everything else within it, they actually can get that service. And the beauty of that is development then adds that growth that everybody's very keen to see locally, which indeed then can help bring more revenue into council budgets. And planning is very much seen as that growth. So local plan-led, strategic plan-led resourcing are very fundamental to answering your question.
Yeah. I mean, certainly on the question of the local plan, the government wouldn't disagree with you. They have been outspoken about the fact they expect every local authority to have a plan and, will take action if they don't. Can you just briefly explain why you think we are in a position where 60% of local authorities don't have a signed-off local plan?
I will try to do that very briefly. Resourcing has been part of it. So of those 50% of budgets going and 25% of officers, local plans have been hit very hard. But you will be aware that there has been talk of planning reform for quite some time. Indeed, just taking the last 4 years alone, we've had 2 white papers and a bill. We're about to go into more bills. If you're charged with producing a local plan locally and you have to answer to your local taxpayers, you may have taken a decision to pause production of that local plan until you knew where the rules were going to end up to avoid any abortive work. Now, we won't comment on that. That's for local leaders to decide. But I suspect some of the back and forth on planning policy may have seen some delays in production of the local plan. So we've been very clear with the Minister and his team. Of course, we recognise why any incoming government wants to make legislative change, primary and secondary, but could we have it quickly, please, so that communities, local leaders, our members, everybody knows what the rules of the game are, and then they can move forward with a local plan. So it's a combination of the lack of funding and resourcing to produce these local plans, and then some of the complexities associated with changing some of those rules, and indeed you may well hear more of that. So we are where we are with it. There's an important need to move forward quickly and really nail down those legislative requirements as soon as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Kite, can I ask you, what do you see as what needs to be in place in order for the government to be able to build the number of houses they wish without damaging the natural environment?
I would echo a lot of what you've just heard from Dr. Hills. I think the plan-led system is absolutely crucial. However, whether we're talking about the potential to switch to environmental outcome reports under the Planning Infrastructure Bill that's coming, or whether we're looking at the government's planning reform paper that was published before Christmas, those all advocate a switch to a more strategic approach to dealing with environmental problems upstream in the planning process in one way or another. We can get into the detail of that later. I think that's the core principle of that is good. We do need to get out in front of environmental problems and put in place solutions so that when the development happens, it can happen swiftly, there's no delay, there's no logjam. What I would say, though, is that if you're going to effectively lock in decisions earlier on in the planning process, you also need to front-load the environmental collection and the environmental assessment processes so that the consequences of those decisions are properly understood, so that development is directed to the right sites, in the right places, in the right quantums, in the right way. Otherwise, what happens is you lock in bad decisions, and then when the development is delivered, you're up against environmental buffers, there are more delays, there are more log jams. So I see that as crucial, really, and I can go into more detail on that if you wish, but perhaps when we come onto the Nature Restoration Fund. Capacity in local authorities, I think, is an issue. SIME is aware that the ecology sector as a whole is under-resourced. And that is likely to present quite a barrier. Symes prepared a briefing on this for the Nature Minister called Green Jobs for Nature, and has a Green Jobs for Nature programme. I'm told that we're at liberty to share that briefing if it would be of interest to the committee. But effectively, we know we need to greatly increase the capacity of not just ecologists, but ecologists with a particular understanding of the way that the land use planning system works. Yeah. Because it doesn't help if you're incredibly expert in a particular taxa of living organism if you don't know how to advise land use planning decisions to bring about a better outcome for those things. So it's a particular part of the ecology sector that we really need to upskill. And Syme's been doing such things as introducing a level 4 apprenticeships and skills boot camps, finding non-degree pathways for entry into the profession. It's got its Green Jobs for Nature initiative, as I mentioned. It's been forming partnerships between employers, stakeholder organisations to help bring people into the profession. And there's a whole load of other initiatives that are in the briefing that I can share. Pay is definitely an issue. Office for National Statistics data suggests that graduate starting salary for an ecologist is about £7,000 less than a nurse or a teacher, and about £9,000 less than a planner. And we also know, for example, that bodies like Natural England, agencies attached to DEFRA, ecologists that work in that organisation will be paid less than equivalent grades in other parts of DEFRA, for example. So it doesn't encourage people to enter the profession. And I think something that I'd add to that is there needs to be greater value placed on the natural environment as a profession, and some of the rhetoric and the politics that surround that discourages people from joining the sector. So at the moment, Syme's carrying out a survey of its members, the State of the Profession survey. That's not finished yet, but as of...
If I can stop you there,
sure.
We'll get a chance to explore this, but I'm keen to sort of stick to the question at this stage. So the Planning Institute believe we need more planners, the Ecology believe we need more ecologists. Now we'll turn to the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So what do we need more of? From your perspective, what do you think that that the government need to make sure is in place in order for their house building targets to be done without damaging the environment?
So you're not going to be surprised for me to follow that theme. It's a lack of skills. We need qualified people, but not necessarily just in new ways of thinking and new ways of working. For example, if you get the planning and then you start constructing, you need the building control specialists to sign off that the buildings are fit for purpose, meet the requirements, and that they understand the environmental regulations and implications within that as well. And that goes right across the life cycle. We need more environmental surveyors, and we need more surveyors in construction who understand carbon and how to decarbonise the buildings that we create, and that understand about embodied carbon. And also there needs to be greater understanding of where materials come from. And all of those skills need to be built on top of, for example, the building control skills, where there is just generally a lack of building control inspectors. And in fact, there are people leaving the industry and going completely away from land and built environment. And that's a real challenge, because as Dr. Hill said, we need to speed up the planning system, because the delays in the planning system have financial consequences for the developers. And so if we're looking for them to put new measures in around preserving the environment that often come at a cost, we need to find that cost elsewhere. And if we can shorten the timescales around planning, that frees up resource to help with identifying and implementing the requirements around the environmental and the sustainable measures.
Yeah, and I think the government wouldn't disagree with that. I've heard the Prime Minister and others say on many occasions they're looking to speed up the planning process, and it's far too long in this country. Now, I'm slightly facetious in my question, but the point was a good one, is that we hear this all the time, if only there were more people doing my job, everything would be better. Now, the government clearly want the same aim as you. They want to speed up the planning process. To what extent does the government therefore need to be more prescriptive about what the demands are, so that both developers and planners know what the expectation is, so that this whole process can actually be intervened in less? Is that something that you would expect the government going forward? And we've heard the Prime Minister say previously, if it's kind of in the local plan and it meets with that test, then it shouldn't be going to councils, it should be able to get this much more quickly. Ms Neal, do you think we need to see government in their planning frameworks being much more prescriptive about what is and isn't acceptable, so that everyone knows where they are?
Absolutely. It's really unclear when you put a planning application in as to whether you will definitely get consent or not. And with that, it's causing delays, and that stalls the entire market. And as we all know, developing nothing creates nothing. Developing something gives us the homes that we need. I think there's also a need, whilst focusing on new build as well, a need to look at retrofit, which may not be delayed in the same way by planning, and is part of the solution to delivering these ambitious targets for 1.5 million homes.
So, I mean, in terms of that, do you see real differences to effectively, so on the face of it, identical applications across two different local authorities, two different planners will interpret the same rules differently?
I think that Dr Hills is probably better placed to answer that question.
I mean, it's just from your perspective. I'm about to ask her. Do you see it going in there that this is something that happens?
Yes, and there are different timescales depending on which authority is looking at your application. There can be a perception that certain authorities have a different take on the type of development that you want to create and the importance of the sustainability and environmental considerations within that.
And so, coming to you, Dr Hills, I mean, how prescriptive would you like to see government be? Do you think these decisions are best taken locally in local context, or actually we need government to just be much more prescriptive so we don't maybe need as much discussion about whether or not something's going to be approved?
There's two particular points to that question, and just before I do, just to make the point, in the UK we have a discretionary planning system.
You make a great politician, by the way. Yeah.
And the discretionary system is emulated about half the world, particularly the Commonwealth, and the permitting zoning system is in the other half of the world. Just to be clear, we've had a discretionary system in the UK for the last 80 or 90 years, and actually, despite all the complaints and moaning, people quite like it because they can have a say, and there's a democratic mandate for councillors to get involved and the community and all the rest of it. That being said, to answer your question, what would help provide some greater certainty, some greater consistency? One of the things that came out of the previous Planning Act, because it did make it that far, the LURA, was national development management policies. So we will be urging the government to not leave those on the shelf, but dust them off, please. And if we can have some conformity of some standard policies, the sort of things that are just being referred to, so that you're not playing a guessing game locally on the interpretation, that would be a helpful thing. The National Development Planning Framework is meant to create the rules. That's the big strategic rule book. And then you have local plans to interpret those rules locally. If you can take some of the mystery out by having national development management policies, we think that that would be helpful. And we were obviously waiting for a consultation on those, and went into election, the rest is history, but the provision is still there. So I think that's very important. But so is, to answer the second part of your question, ensuring that you do not lose what is the gem in our system globally, and that's the democratic accountability, the transparency, and the ability to involve local communities. And that's really important. I don't think there's any sense of moving away from that. But by doing that, that means where you need to, you'll take things to a planning committee for that rigour and oversight. Does too much? Sorry, there was a second.
If I could just maybe challenge that, because I'm not sure you're right. I think I've heard the Prime Minister and others say actually we shouldn't be having so many decisions going to local planning committees. If we've got a local plan, if the plans that's been submitted are in an area that's been approved for housing, we've got an approved local plan, then there should be a presumption of acceptance. So how confident can you be that actually that thing that local oversight is still going to be wanted?
So the second point I was just going to make was exactly that. All too often our members have their decisions overturned by local councillors when things are in conformity with a local plan. And what we are advocating for, and will be through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, is where you have a competent Chief Planning Officer, we feel that should be a statutory position. By the way, it's not currently.
Many are not.
Pardon?
How many do you assess are not competent?
All of our members are competent. Not all chief planners are our members. That's the point I'm trying to make. So we would like to have competent chief planning officers, and therefore, if you have a competent chief planning officer, they're perfectly capable with their professional standards at taking a decision on something that's in conformity with the local plan. Does that need to go to committee or not? That's the conversation government are having through their working paper on planning committees, which is what you referred to. So I think actually we agree that there is a route for having competent officers deal with things that are in conformity with the local plan. But what I'm saying is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You need to have the scrutiny there for the things that aren't in conformity, so that the local people can have the say through their elected leaders as to whether or not that development is appropriate.
I mean, coming to Ms Neal's point, and this is certainly something I've heard from developers and others before, that, well, you know, the rules are the rules, but you go to one council, they'll interpret it like this, another council will be more laissez-faire on it. I mean, do you think that's just because different planners make different decisions, or because actually there's a lack of clarity in what these rules mean?
I don't think there's any lack of clarity in what the National Planning Policy Framework means. I don't think there is any lack of clarity or understanding from our competently, professionally qualified planners in their advice to committees. There may be some differences of opinion by locally elected leaders. Maybe. So, that's what I was referring to in overturns.
Right.
And that is a democratic mandate that exists. There is a current proposal on the table that may seek to change that through planning committees going forward. That's not for us to comment further. That's a government proposal at the moment. But all I'm saying is, in that scenario, we would want anybody charged with taking those decisions that were in conformity with the local plan to be a statutory chief planning officer with a professional qualification attached.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take that. Mr. Kite, if we come to you, I mean, we've heard there about maybe we need government to be a bit more prescriptive. Do you have any concerns about that, or would you like, do you think that will sort of remove the professional sort of the extent to which ecologists are listened to because government have kind of set more prescriptive rules, or would you support that more prescriptive approach?
I don't think it would be problematic if the formulation of those rules at the national level had the appropriate input from ecologists and from the regulatory and statutory agencies involved in ecology, so Natural England, the Environment Agency, maybe even the Office for Environmental Protection, for example. I have a lot of personal experience of planning applications where professional officers have recommended approval, the local ecologist has been happy, but then concerns have been raised by members, so elected members, elected councillors. So I think I do recognise what Dr Hill's saying there between the sort of the national imperative of delivering homes and local resistance. And I think that's an issue that sort of strays outside my remit. It's not an ecological issue really, it's to do with balancing democratic priorities. So I think that's where my commentary has to stop. But I think fundamentally, when a national planning policy framework or any set of rules is written, as long as it has the right input and it keeps key golden threads such as, for example, the mitigation hierarchy, so the need to avoid harm first, mitigate harm and then compensate for a last resort, recognition of key principles like critical natural capital, so irreplaceable habitats, things that you cannot put back, and giving them appropriate weight. As long as that's all there, I wouldn't have too much problem.
Thank you. Julie Buckley.
Okay, thank you. Do you feel there's any danger that nature and biodiversity are seen as second-order priority to net zero considerations in house building expansions, or do you think there's a synergy between the two?
I think, interestingly, the way that the legislation has come forward for some biodiversity aspects, let's take biodiversity net gain, the statutory basis that has is actually in a game of planning top trumps. It actually sits right at the top currently. It even becomes before affordable housing delivery. Wow. So there is no danger of biodiversity not being important in the planning process. The danger is in the implementation of it, as we were hearing in the last session. So its statutory status afforded to it through the Environment Bill is really quite significant, and it's very important indeed, and that's why this whole issue has arisen quite quickly over the last year, because it is a really clear statutory requirement for development to commence. It arguably has at the moment more of a legal weight to it than net zero. We're advocating that net zero catches up a bit, the legislation, but that's for a different session.
We heard from some previous speakers that the enforcement is not quite so strong, and when we asked about penalties, nobody could scratch around and find any. So is it perhaps the case, although that the legal words might be there, that perhaps the follow-up enforcement penalties isn't quite in place, and so therefore it doesn't necessarily flow through?
I mean, just to be clear, we've looked at this issue quite a bit. If I was speaking to my chief officers, as I did a lot last year, and said, what's your top two issues? This will be right up there with nutrient neutrality, because of the preparedness point. You know, how is it going to work? What I will preface before I say anything next is it's very early days. This is a new system. It's a completely new system, and it will take some time to bed in. But what we are seeing, and actually you don't have to take my word for it, you could read the National Audit report from last May, which came up with 10 recommendations, precisely on these points on monitoring, oversight, data, enforcement, consistency of policies, you name it, they've listed the lot out. I mean, you could almost lift the 10 recommendations out and put them in your report, because, as far as I know, DEFRA have not responded to that report yet. And they're quite serious recommendations that are now manifesting itself in some of the evidence that you've heard this afternoon already. So I can speak on our behalf of members who work in the private sector and the public sector, and what they would say is it's a bit of a mixed picture. Okay. It's very market-led. You've got some solutions coming forward and working incredibly well, and then you've got, for example, some local authority monitoring that perhaps isn't even happening at all. So I think the picture's a bit mixed.
Very helpful. Could I ask you, Ben Kite, the same question about whether those two compete or whether they're in synergy, the net gain and the zero?
I think there should be a synergy there which often isn't recognised. So, for example, nature-based solutions to adapting to climate change or mitigating climate change, I think the potential of those is under-recognised in the planning process. So just to give you one example, in 2022, the All-Party Parliamentary Group had a meeting of experts to which the Floodplain Meadows Partnership was invited. And that highlighted the fact that if only a relatively small amount of floodplain meadows were restored to a species-rich grassland, as where a lot of them are currently drained for arable use or other mainly forms of agricultural use, then a vast amount of carbon could be locked up in British floodplains, and it could other benefits would also flow from that, such as floodwater attenuation, cleaning water before it gets to rivers to improve nutrient neutrality, those sorts of things. Those opportunities are not really actively seized because of inadequate filtering of that environmental information into decision making in the plan in the sort of plan-led process. You know, so for example, if local nature recovery strategies were to identify areas where floodplains could be restored, and local authorities were to pick up the measures that are needed to do that, turn them into a tariff effectively, so that smaller developers could deliver their biodiversity net gain commitments more easily, that could fund the restoration of floodplain hay meadows across the country, sequester carbon, improve flood resilience, all of those benefits. But it's it's currently lost. It's not there. So in answer to your question, there should be a synergy there, but it's not adequately recognised in decision making.
Such a fantastic example. Could I ask you to write in with more details about that? Because we're looking for examples exactly like that to help us understand. Could I ask you quite quickly the same question, whether net gain and net biodiversity, whether they are in synergy or are they competing demands on house builders?
I think we obviously welcome the biodiversity net gain and the 10% increase, but I don't think that is the solution on its own. We've got to look at embedding better carbon capture and carbon consideration. RICS feel very strongly about this, and we have in the last 12 to 18 months worked on delivering the whole life carbon assessment standard, along with doing industry collaboration on the built environment carbon database, which will provide the data to support the measurement and the consistent measurement of carbon within the natural and built environment processes. And on top of that, we also are part of a wider industry collaboration for the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. And all of this is to help that consistent measurement that we need, on top of looking also at my colleagues' comments about flooding, for example. You know, if we build in all of these areas, we reduce the amount of surface water drainage that there is, and that then leads back into additional flooding, exacerbating the climate crisis problems that are being created. And that's not good for growth within the country.
Thank you. Hope you don't mind, but it does feel as though that might be quite voluntary. So you're providing availability of a data set. You're asking applicants to tell us firstly about biodiversity net gain, and then secondly to tell us about carbon. And they can access this database if they want to apply it. Is there not an opportunity to put all that together in that application, that it be a single question and that they be required to use that data set? At the moment, surely all of this is just voluntary. Is that right?
Well, RICS members have to adopt the whole life carbon assessment as part of their regulatory requirements under the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. And when we produced the standard, we wrote it with the entire industry in mind. So yes, for other members who aren't part of our professional body, it's their choice to adopt it. But we are seeing, obviously, that particularly larger institutional investors and developers, their requirements for their own stakeholders, their shareholders, for example, are requiring greater consistency. There's also, obviously, financial reporting that requires this. And that's why the consistency of measurement is so important, because we all know you can't have 5 buildings being the first carbon zero building.
So anything that could encourage or enforce that consistency of measure could actually help to make sure you're all using the same units.
Absolutely, and if we can embed that in the whole process as something that people do adopt and use, then the comparisons across the industry and what you're delivering as well will help to support the growth that we need, because it will be easier to understand what you're doing.
Thank you very much, that's great.
Thank you. Ellie Jones.
Thank you. This leads beautifully on to the question that I wanted to ask, which was about embodied carbon and whole life carbon assessment. So, it's a lovely segue there. So, Ms. Neal, if I can sort of just to drill down on that a little bit. So, it sounds like you're saying that in the absence of government actually regulating on embodied carbon, basically organisations like RICS have worked together within the sector to come up with standards because of a hole, essentially, in the government's engagement in regulation of embodied carbon and whole life carbon assessment. Is that a fair characterisation?
We believe there was a gap, and therefore we created the whole life carbon assessment standard to meet that gap and to allow that consistency of understanding of terminology and how to apply it and measure it, and to create that consistent methodology. Across industry, there has been further gaps identified, which is why the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is made up of, there were 10 founding members, but we're supported with sponsors from much wider parties within the industry who felt there was a need for this standard. That standard is voluntary, unlike whole life carbon for the Royal Institution members. And the Built Environment Carbon Database was to capture a lot of the information that would be needed to feed into the whole life carbon assessment and UK net zero carbon building standard. They all talk to each other as well, to make sure that we're not creating confusion and that the result is clarity and better measurement.
But we still, these are all voluntary measures effectively within the framework of a lack of clear government policy and strategy on this.
If we could get the government policy to embed it, it would be a fantastic solution.
Yeah. What do you think about the fact that the updated MPPF makes no mention of embodied carbon?
We would welcome a consultation around embodied carbon and the subsequent solutions and regulations being put in place around that.
Yeah, we need more than a consultation, don't we? We need we need regulation on this. So how well equipped is the building sector itself to address embodied carbon? Because of course this is becoming increasingly important, isn't it? We've seen evidence that suggests that if 1.5 million homes are built in the next 5 years, then just the embodied carbon in those homes could eat up 5 to 9% of the UK's carbon budget in the next 5 years. And as buildings become somewhat more energy efficient, the embodied carbon becomes a more and more significant component, doesn't it? So how well equipped is the building industry overall to tackle this?
I think there are two different groups here. Obviously, the larger and leading parties within the built environment are often more informed and have the advice provided to them with the understanding and skills that sit behind that to be able to understand what it means and to look at innovative ways and to introduce new technology into the work that they're doing. I think what we need is greater upskilling for the smaller SME developers, for example, who may not have that support network to explain and to embed the required understanding and knowledge and practical solutions around this. At the RACS, we're doing a piece of work on carbon terminology because we recognise that there is a lack there. It's not consistent across the industry, the understanding around this and the importance of it. And I think where there is less understanding, there's an element of fear and therefore you don't get the implementation in the same way. That's not true of everyone, though. There are plenty of often the larger developers or institutional investors who are building out, who do have that knowledge, but it needs to be more joined up right across the value chain.
Thank you. And perhaps to you or to other members of the panel, if you'd like to comment. Ms. Neal talked about the potential of new technology to help address this. AI, we always need to ask a question about AI. What are there technologies that are going to be helpful in the next 5 years in terms of reducing the embodied carbon footprint of those 1.5 million homes? Can you give examples of those? Any comments on that?
I'm happy to go first. I think one of the best tools or gifts that AI can give us is better manipulation of data in a positive sense, and having open access data on all the things we talked about, carbon, biodiversity, nature, environment generally. Part of the challenge at the moment of trying to find out exactly what's going on is that the data is all held in various places. Some of it's privately owned, some of it isn't. And, you know, you've heard from an industry body, it's had to set up a standard in the absence of there being one. I think what AI will do is help us get a better handle on at least the baseline situation so that you can do some consistent monitoring. at a big data level that everybody can get involved in, regardless of whether they're an SME, medium-sized, major developer. And putting that open source, I think, should be a priority for the governments. I think that is where we need to get to on carbon monitoring, on carbon data, but on all the environment data. So that's where I would suggest that AI could be helpful, and to know where you need to get to, you need to have an accurate picture of everything that's going on currently, and I'm not sure if we've got that across the whole development piece, which tends to work in a rather siloed way, and I think there's definitely room for improvement there. But also within AI, and you'll know this already, there is an urgent need for some guidance, some clarity on how it's used, how it's not used, and some industry standards. Not just for industry standards for us, but industry standards for AI, so that we can know how it can be used and, quite frankly, be on the front foot rather than the back foot. So if we take biodiversity net gain, AI is being actively used in monitoring it, but the standards aren't really there. There are no monitoring guidelines, especially that say how it could be used. So local authorities are left looking at this stuff saying, well, it looks okay to me, but is it really? So, and that's because it's been market-led, industry-led. So if we could have some standards as to what sort of data is required, how it's required in the context of BNG, but also how AI can be used and not used, I think that would be very helpful, because I feel that this is the year that AI sort of is moved around into the front pole position, is kind of getting on with its stuff, and I think the industry needs to catch up and say what good looks like, and that needs to happen quite urgently. Thank you.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is just on the use of AI for complicated tasks such as biodiversity net gain assessment, for example. It definitely has a lot of potential for processing large volumes of data and helping a limited ecological workforce deal with the workload. But I don't think it yet is at the stage where you can absent human checking from the process. I mean, there are a number of companies out there at the moment that offer AI biodiversity net gain led biodiversity net gain assessments. I haven't looked at them all, but I've looked at a couple, and they were considerably wrong once I'd ground truthed and actually been there to see what was there in practice. I think what they do is they look at open source data and satellite imagery to try and work out what habitats are present, and that some habitats are so similar it's not possible to tell, so the AI makes mistakes. So I don't think we're at the stage yet where you can absent a human checking stage. There is a very interesting project being led at the moment by the University of Surrey, I think it's called Space for Nature, where they're actually using satellite tools to map habitats, and then they're going out and ground truthing what's there and feeding that information back into the machine learning process to help the AI become more sophisticated at classifying habitats. So they're probably about as far ahead as it's possible to get. And there are commercial services that are not at that stage that are offering services. So I think it definitely has a lot of potential. It's not an area we can afford to ignore. If we want to achieve building on the scale that the government has as an aspiration, it's got to be embraced as a tool, but I'd add a note of caution that it needs to be done carefully.
Thank you. Can I just... Sorry, I was going to say, may I just add to that? In using AI, to your point, it's about the responsible use of it, but also we need the human element to be able to ask the right questions of the AI and to identify the variables that we understand take place in the market to ensure that the question is right and that you've asked it to consider the right factors. So whilst it can definitely help optimise, for example, better design of buildings by being able to model operational and embodied carbon, and can help with sort of land acquisition and looking at scope 3 emissions and BNG, you need to be able to ask it the right question, and you need to have confidence that you can then interrogate the answer to ensure that it's correct from that point of view. And RICS at the moment, we're actively working on producing some guidance and best practices around responsible use of AI. But in slightly wider on the tech point, AI is great, but there are other technologies that we can build into new homes to help support, carbon capture or better energy homes, lower carbon, but you need the users who are living in those homes to be able to understand how to use that technology and what it means. So it's not just about those delivering the homes, creating them with better technology, but it's those who are using them, employing that technology properly.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. If we look at our total carbon budget between 2025 and 2030, we've been talking about embodied carbon. Can you give us an idea of what percentage of that total carbon budget would actually be taken up by the embodied carbon of 1.5 million homes?
We've certainly not modelled that yet. So I couldn't comment. We could commit to come back to you if we've got a handle on it, but it's not a percentage that I can put on the record here at this moment.
That would be very helpful if you would come back to us in writing, Mr. Kite.
I'm afraid that's beyond my knowledge.
We will come back to you in writing on that.
Thank you. We have received evidence that says it would be between 5 and 9% of that total carbon budget. So when we're thinking about all the other aspects of delivering on the 5th and 6th carbon budgets, this is going to be a really critical element. So I think it's really helpful to have the comments that you've made, and Ms. Neal, from the point of view of RICS and the statement that you've made on whole life carbon. I think it's extremely valuable to have that as a standard. Can I ask about the future home standard? Because that too should have a role in delivering our low carbon housing. And I just wonder if you feel it's ambitious enough.
We are awaiting the outcome of the consultation from the previous government around the future home standard, and we would welcome the response sooner rather than later, because obviously the regulations that sit under this need to be implemented, and it causes delays and confusion if developers aren't able to see what they're going to have to build and make sure that they are meeting the requirements that we know are coming. Absolutely, we welcome it. I think often you can always improve on things. That it's a minimum standard, and obviously there are always organisations that go above and beyond and look to do that. But ultimately, often, people will build to that minimum standard, and that minimum standard obviously needs to be fit for purpose. And if we want to embed within that all the environmental and sustainable requirements that we believe need to be in there, that needs to be done now and clearly, so that everyone in the industry knows what those requirements are.
So basically, when we look at things like solar panels, there's been debate between the previous government and this government as to just what the role of solar panels on new build should be. But would you like to see it mandated that as a default, not in every case, because it's not suitable in every case, but the default should be that solar panels are on new build, unless it's clear that they would not be able to produce the carbon emissions, the carbon savings that we're looking for?
I think that we would welcome multiple different answers to better energy efficiency and creating greener energy. I don't think it's just linked to the particular house either, though. It's got to go wider. We've got to look at the grid. We've got to look at innovative technologies and what they mean. And we've got to do it quickly so that we have certainty that they are going to deliver the targets that we're trying to achieve, and that there aren't subsequent knock-on effects unintended further down the line, and that what we're building now is fit for purpose in 30, 40, 50 years.
Well, let's look at that forward and the targets that we have for 2050, because the one thing we do know is that between 75 and 85% of the houses that we're going to have in 2050 have already been built. So what's the importance of retrofitting here? How should we be looking at that in comparison with new build? And what are your views on that?
Absolutely. The Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors are fully supportive of retrofit alongside new build. We have just created a retrofit standard for residential properties, and that's to ensure that the public have high quality, highly skilled professionals delivering that retrofit advice to them, to make sure that they are genuinely retrofitting to the right standards, that they are future-proofing those properties, and that they will be resilient to change in climate. I think.
So when, sorry, if I can turn to Dr. Hills, when an application comes forward to bulldoze an existing property, should there be an obligation to look at retrofitting before that happens?
Well, I think there's an opportunity to look at strengthening the requirements on that. And just to be clear, on this new home standard, our position on that is we just need that certainty and clarity as soon as possible. It's been back and forth and delayed and going on. And as you just pointed out, even if you decide it today, when's it actually going to have an impact? Because the pipeline is so long of stuff that's already in train. So we would urge there is no day to waste on that point. On knocking down buildings, this is a particular pet topic of mine, because before I did this job, I ran London's second mayoral development corporation, and you only have to put a ring around a piece of land and say that's where we'd like to start developing, and guess what? People start knocking buildings down before you can get to it. I'm not naming any names, but if they are watching, they'll know who I'm talking about. And so I'm all for strengthening the opportunity, the tools in the toolkit, to at least have a conversation before you start knocking buildings down. There are other people who are far better qualified to talk about this, but I would say, over and above the provisions of listed buildings, conservation areas and all the rest of it, it would seem sensible to have a conversation about whether or not it might be better to leave the building standing and retrofit it than knock it down. There is obviously some very high profile rows about this that have gone on quite recently, and I'm sure there'll be lots more to come. But where we sit in all of that is it probably could benefit from some strengthening of that conversation part before we just see, well, that's a shame the building went. And that's speaking from experience.
I think you and I could become good friends on that one. Yes.
I'll take you on a site visit and show you where some beautiful buildings once stood.
I have some in my own constituency, don't you worry. Look, so far when we've been thinking about this whole issue of whole life carbon, what you've said to us is we want clarity of standards, we want uniformity of application of those standards, and that is going to require government mandating and regulation. So these are the things that you would like this committee to recommend in the report, we take it? Is that right?
Yes.
And when it comes to the data, open source data with, again, clarity of standards, so that it's absolutely apparent to everybody what we are dealing with and what we're achieving as a result.
Absolutely. And I take my pupillage there from working for the previous Mayor of London, who took a decision to make all the transport data open source, yes, because TfL were better at running services than they were running tech platforms. In doing so, London's travel experience infinitely improved because all these tech platforms popped up and told you the best way to move around. It's the same principle. Make the data publicly accessible and find solutions to have that open source monitoring, and at least everybody understands what the starting point was.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. Some very quick questions from me, so I'd appreciate some very concise answers if that's okay, because we've got a lot to cover. So this is just all about BNG, and I just firstly want to ask you all, if government does achieve the 1.5 million homes, will current biodiversity net gain requirements be sufficient to ensure that the natural environment is supported to recover? So I'll start at this end. Yes or no?
We need to go further.
Okay, we need to go further. And what? I'll come back to you then, but how about yourself, Dr. Hills?
It should be, but it does need resourcing properly to enable planning departments to get on the front foot and being able to negotiate to push further than perhaps has previously arrived on the table.
Trying to keep it concise, biodiversity net gain asks developers to provide an enhancement over the habitats that they're losing, effectively, the development site. It doesn't deal with the environmental impacts of a development in terms of whether or not something's being affected by air pollution, water pollution, recreational pressure, etc. So on its own, biodiversity net gain is not enough. It needs the whole mitigation hierarchy to be implemented through the planning system.
Would you specifically want to see an increase in net gain from 10%? And would that be feasible, and how high would you want that to make it deliverable as well?
I think from my point of view, when I was saying we need more, it was more akin to what my colleague was saying about looking at the wider implications as well, you know, air pollution, etc.
So, as I said, we're not going to put a percentage on it. We think that local authorities can be more ambitious in pursuing more creative, more biodiversity net gain. But in order for them to do that, they do need to have a team in place to do it. And as we've already heard, those people just aren't there, or if they are, they're one person, and they're doing everything. So there is absolutely the opportunity to go further, but we're not going to put a percentage on it because, as I said right at the start, we have a discretionary planning system, and that's one of the beauties of it. People don't like it, but because it's discretionary, it means you can always go higher. And so everything's a minimum. And that means you can be creative and deliver great things.
Do you have any other views?
I think before you push beyond 10%, we need to iron out the kinks with the current system and the current metric, because there are occasions when the metric can result in a perverse outcome, and where the process is hindering, particularly, for example, the delivery of small sites. Small development sites are struggling to meet their biodiversity net gain requirements. Also, as you heard from Ms Postlethwaite in the previous evidence session, problems with deliverability, where what's been put in the calculation isn't actually what appears on the ground. So I think we need to iron out those problems first and actually get to 10%. Because otherwise what happens is we just put a number on it, 20%, and the negative consequences will be felt in particular by small developers, and it's not real, because if we're not achieving 10% there's no point in going further. But once those things are ironed out, then we can look at 20%, and some local authorities are already asking for 20% and have started to look at the viability of imposing that on developers.
Thank you, that's useful. How confident are you that there is sufficient transparency, consistency and accountability in the way that developers and builders are required to deliver BMG improvements? Should we start again with you, Ms Neal? Sorry, I'm just going right to left.
I think standards are the answer to the transparency, because the regulation of those standards requires that transparency to be disclosed. I think that it's part of a much bigger picture on this, and I think that depending on the size of the builder, that has a significant impact on how they are able to disclose and measure that sort of side of things.
I think there's any thing that you would recommend us to kind of point to that might improve that situation for smaller?
I think we've just got to upskill more and make sure that people understand what the requirements are and how they assess that, and that they have access to professionals who can provide the correct advice. That's a real challenge for the smaller parties in the market.
Very quickly, from our perspective, there's a credibility point here. Everybody wants to make it work and everybody wants it to work, and it's really, really important it works because everybody notices what's going on in nature around them, and we need to make it work. But at the moment, you've got a quite curious system where you've got some on-site, some off-site, some of it's monitored here by local authority. The stuff over there is monitored by, well, goodness knows who are they reportable to? But hey, the system's working. So, the whole thing needs to have a really solid look at it, which is for the credibility of the developer, the credibility of my members, which are saying we need this and we must deliver it and here's the tax and pay for it and off we go. If you then got your members sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, we've been into that field and there's nothing there, the whole thing then turns into a bit of a Ponzi system, quite frankly, and we all want to avoid that. So we've got to get it working better. Now, there are some fantastic places where it's working, and there are some horror stories. We would urge the government to respond to the NAO report and come up with a very clear plan on how they're going to monitor the data, how they're going to recommend the enforcement happens, and how they're going to move to a plan-led system rather than market-led. Because at the moment, you've got a case-by-case basis. A development pops up here, well, we'll do a bit of off-site over there. If you're going to move to a land use framework in DEFRA, if you're going to move to a nature recovery scheme to deal with nutrient neutrality, why are we dealing with BNG on a case-by-case basis? It makes no sense at all. So we've got to elevate the whole thing into a strategic position. We would argue strategic planning is the place to do it. Devolution Bill provides an opportunity to have new strategic planning. Let's put nature at the heart of that, and then you can bring in BNG and everything else. And then,
do you think that BNG is a bit of a gimmick and then not?
I don't think it's a gimmick. I think it's really important, but I think there's a danger it gets seen of that. If you're just paying a tax and the trees weren't there and the community got sort of told a story that didn't happen, then the whole credibility falls apart quite quickly. So we could be world leading in our BNG, but there is an urgent need to, your word, sort the wrinkles out, was it? Yes. We need to sort the wrinkles out.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. Mr. Kite.
I think I agree with what's been said before, really. I think the next stage of improving BNG, beyond ironing out the wrinkles I mentioned before, is really drilling down on monitoring standards. As you've heard, you've got this hodgepodge at the moment where you have some BNG delivered on-site, and often the stewardship of that in the past, those areas in the past would be handed to a management company with no ecological expertise or knowledge of how to deliver it and look after it. That has to improve, and a lot of developers are really cognizant of that risk at the moment, that they hand BNG to a management company that then makes a mess of it, and then in 10 years' time they're pointing to that and saying we're going to deliver this biodiversity net gain, and people are pointing to their previous schemes and saying we didn't last time, and they're really aware of that and really worried about it and looking for solutions to make sure that those areas are handed to safe hands and monitored properly and looked after. The same is true as off-site sites that are looked after and monitored by responsible bodies. So I think we need to move towards a concept of a high-integrity biodiversity unit, so that what we saw initially in carbon markets with the genuineness of a carbon unit being questionable in some instances, that doesn't occur in the biodiversity unit market.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Pippa Halings.
Thank you. And it's good to know that in my constituency of South Cambridge is one of those areas where they are pushing within the emerging local plan for 20% biodiversity net gain, just because they see that, it's within the margin of error trying to get 10%. So actually, but whilst trying to wrinkle out the errors, obviously. But we've also heard here that it's not just about biodiversity net gain, it's also about the environmental enhancements across the board which are needed. And we have heard from the government the planned restoration, nature restoration fund. And the government said it will only put it into legislation if it can confirm that this will enable positive outcomes for the environment. Yet last week the Chancellor said that she would reduce environmental requirements on developers if they put into the fund. And as she would quote, and as this means that the developers can get on with building and they don't have to worry about the bats and newts, kind of in her words. So I would like to ask you, particularly Ben, Mr. Kite, when you were saying that you wanted to look at the strategic nature of this, and perhaps the Nature Restoration Fund can provide this, the question would be, how can the Nature Restoration Fund balance positive environmental outcomes at a strategic level whilst loosening requirements on developers?
So I think the core principle behind the Nature Restoration Fund and the idea of having delivery plans to deal with environmental problems, in that what you do is you identify environmental issues that may block development, you parachute in with a sort of state-led intervention through a delivery body to create a plan for avoiding that effect and therefore remove the blockage. That core principle is a good one. We've needed that for a long time, because a lot of the time what happens is development gets directed to where it's going to go, the problem is only picked up at project level, and then that's when delays occur to developers. However, the planning reform paper isn't really that clear on how that's going to work in practice. It creates more questions than it answers, I think. Simon's going to be responding on this in full to the government, so I'll just pick up a few key points in it. One of them is that if you're going to take money off a developer, allow them to build, and then the delivery body goes away, works out what the problem is, works out what the solution is to that problem, procures any land or resources it needs to, then delivers it, then sees whether or not it's worked. There's a significant time lag potentially between enabling the development to happen and then the intervention coming about. And the danger is that in that time lag, harm occurs. So, for example, if there are waterways that are already over environmental thresholds for pollution, you're adding to that before the solution comes into play. So, you might end up with, a river itching without salmon or lamprey, because in that time period, things were allowed to develop to a problem. So, I think the government needs to focus on implementing these delivery plans on environmental problems that are already known and where there is already a good evidence base for implementing a solution, and they need to be done rapidly. What we mustn't do is fast-track action where there isn't an evidence base for an effective solution, and that time lag might become too great. I also think there's an issue about scrutiny here, because the paper that the government put out seems to suggest that a delivery body will identify the problem, work up the solution, deliver the solution, monitor the solution, and then tell you whether or not it's been effective. So at no point, it seems, is there a third party saying, did it work? Is it likely to work? And carrying out that sort of independent check. So I think there does need to be, if you're a local authority writing a local plan, you have to take it to a public examination and convince an inspector that it's sound and deliverable. And these delivery plans, I think, are potentially just as consequential for our environment as a local plan. So they should have some form of check and balance in there somewhere to say, is it likely to work? And then later on, has it worked? There has to be that accountability. There's other issues, the mitigation hierarchy, for example. To me, that is absolutely core. That's a golden thread that mustn't be lost. And I could go on, but I sense probably that's enough. Other points will be in our formal response to government, and we can share that with the committee.
I think if you could share it with the committee, that would be very good. I will go on to ask Dr. Hilt as well, but I would also just like, if you have an example that you could show of where it has worked, where you think this is based on a very good example, we'd really like to hear something like that.
I can certainly do that. And one of the questions is, why do we need legal changes to make some of these things happen? Because there are already strategic approaches, for example, to delivering SANG, so places to absorb recreational pressure. And it took a long time for those to come about and be implemented, but they now exist and they now are facilitating development. So why do we need an extra mechanism to do that? Why do we need to change the law? And I think some of those questions are not really answered by the planning reform paper.
Thank you. Just very briefly, we strongly support the strategic approach, and indeed we were asking DEFRA for that for some time. So we're really delighted that they are moving towards this with Natural England. What I would say is we are concerned about how those delivery plans are going to link with the local statutory spatial plan. And we haven't got any assurances yet that the two things are talking to each other and how they're talking to each other.
Can you just explain where that could create a problem?
Well, it could create a problem if Natural England, let's just say they were the delivery partner, maybe, may not be, got some funding to deliver a solution to an identified problem by them, which was completely at odds with something that was in the local plan, with some land that had been earmarked for development elsewhere. And in this era of needing to smooth the regulation, not reduce regulation, but get regulation working in a more efficient way, we would say, rather than removing it. Of course, you need all the checks and balances together. you've got to start linking environmental reports to statutory land plans. The point I made to the Secretary of State on Friday when he launched the new land use plan for DEFRA, really important document, but if it's got no statutory basis, it is just a wish list of things you might like to see. So what we've got to move towards is a much more joining up between environmental plans, delivery plans, the new national land use plan, which is for agriculture, and then a national planning framework. One of the asks we're going in for the planning and infrastructure bill is a national spatial plan. Other parts of the UK have one. We do not have one. And all the time we don't have one, you're going to have competing land uses. So Natural England could come up with a fantastic scheme, but it could be completely at odds with what the local authority, combined authority, new development corporation or some other land entity with powers for bringing forward development to meet the growth agenda could have earmarked that site for something completely different. And what would that result in? Nutrient neutrality Mark 2. I'm being a little bit flippant there, but we've just lost sort of 2-3 years of nutrient neutrality. We haven't got a problem, so we'll just put a moratorium on development. We need to move to a more proactive way, which is your point, which is let's think about what good looks like, and then we can all move to it, rather than having plans coming up in different areas that then sort of crash together, and then there has to be a way of working together that you can find the solutions for nature restoration along with the growth. We strongly believe the two can work together, but not in parallel universes. And there is a danger that we've got things going on in parallel here again.
If I'm trying to understand the recommendation key for this committee within this inquiry would be what to accompany the Nature Restoration Fund, would be to...
We would want to see some sort of requirement for the fund and the delivery plans that are proposed to talk to local spatial strategies, whether they be at a district council level, county level, or a new regional, sub-regional level. The two have to speak together. If they're prepared in isolation, then that stores up problems further on down the line, because as we all know, land is in short supply in this country.
So as I understand, yes. If we're hearing it, you say, great thing, because they come in as the body, say, this is the problem, this is the way we can resolve it. To resolve it, we'd need this amount of land or this side of the rivers or this waterway, because this is what will be able to do a nutrient neutrality exercise. But then by the time you've got that and the time you're about to implement it, that land is no longer available because it's been built on, because we've got the push for housing.
It may have been allocated for housing, it may have been allocated for a logistics plant, for power, for carbon storage. It could have been allocated for anything. But the chances are it isn't just sitting there waiting for something to happen. So the point is it all needs to be joined up.
I'd absolutely echo that. I think the key thing is first we need to thresh out what the terms of reference for these delivery plans would be, because that's not really clear from the reform paper that came out. Not all environmental problems will be suitable for this solution. So where this might be useful for dealing with nutrient neutrality, dealing with air pollution, where there's multiple sources of environmental impact diffuse over an area, and the solution is obvious. Identify, purchase and decommission sources of pollution, other sources of pollution, to create the environmental headroom. It's ideally suited for solving those problems, provided there's the evidence to demonstrate that the solution's going to work. But other environmental problems, just to give one, some species like newts are suited to this because their habitat requirements are well understood, and they need ponds, they need terrestrial habitat. Other species, like bats, for example, might be very, very, very reliant on one particular site where they have a big maternity roost. So you won't know that until you get to a project level assessment and you've done a survey of that site and you've found that roost, and you know that there's a very large number of important rare bats there. So some problems will be solved by this, and it has great potential of speeding the delivery of development, but there's also a lot of pitfalls as well. So I think we need clearer terms of reference on how this would work, the mechanisms that would be implemented, and the powers that would be needed by the delivery body to obtain the solution and deliver it.
Am I understanding correctly that you could say that for some environmental issues that are caused by housing, a strategic approach could work, particularly with species that can easily colonise another area because they've got the right habitat. But there are some species, for example, the UK bat species, that would not easily be able to, because they're site loyal, they need that particular site or particular conditions, and that is very difficult to replace. So you could see species extinction if you're only basing it on that strategic level for some problems.
Yes. So newts, we know that they need ponds of a particular type and they need terrestrial habitat around those ponds, and we can use survey techniques that are relatively low cost, comparatively speaking, like eDNA, to find out where they are and where their important populations are, and to replace whatever's taken from them by development. Bats, for example, are not one species. There's lots of UK species, and they all have different habitat requirements. Some of them are generalists that might be more suited to this, but others are, other rarer species have much more exacting habitat requirements, and you wouldn't know which part of the country or even which part of a development site they're relying on until you've got that site-level data. So some problems are very suited to this kind of solution, others are not, and working those out has got to be part of setting the system up.
Thank you. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. Conscious of time, I've got just two quick questions on the importance of local infrastructure in sustainable placemaking. And I think these will be to everyone, but I think we need to keep the answers quite short if we can. So first question, where do you see specific opportunities and challenges for local infrastructure to make a positive contribution to protect nature and minimise carbon emissions? Should we start on the left, Mr. Kite, unless I'm catching you off guard?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very broad question, but any development of any kind can be negative or positive. I think it's a case of carrying out the development in an informed way that follows the mitigation hierarchy, minimises harm, and then delivers on benefits. And the particular benefits that any particular project can deliver will be informed by sources of information such as the local nature recovery strategy. What is needed here? What habitats are best, delivered to best effect here? So I'm not sure there's one single answer to that question, but any development almost can be positive if it's done in the right way.
Great. Dr. Hills?
Just take a slightly different angle. Our starting point is the location of development, and you can have a significant impact on the sustainability of that, any development, homes or schools, whatever, by ensuring you're putting it in somewhere that's accessible by a public transport hub or walking and cycling. Our own research has shown that far too much development is still finding its way in locations that would not be classed as sustainable locations. So the biggest sort of day-to-day footprint you can have is actually how people are moving around. And so it's really important that we're putting the right homes, the right development in the right places. And that's why we think a strategic approach to planning and moving away from homes allocated at very small sort of district levels and districts arguing about those numbers and stretching it out and looking at areas broader with homes and nature and infrastructure means you can have a sensible conversation about where you're putting development, and you'll put it around where the infrastructure is, because there's no more sustainable location than somewhere where infrastructure already exists, whether that be an out-of-town shopping centre that's no longer being used, or whether it be a small town centre that's ripe for intensification. And that will have a positive impact much more than if you were putting that development in locations that weren't sustainable, i.e. greenfield in the middle of nowhere.
Very helpful, thank you. Neal?
I agree. You've got to have the right place, the right infrastructure around that. There is no point in building and someone has to travel an hour to work. It doesn't work in terms of carbon. It also doesn't work from the social point of view of their own personal experiences.
So to help ensure that housing growth and environmental protection is in step, what do you want to see from the forthcoming planning and infrastructure bill? Dr. Hills, I've got a feeling you may have quite a few suggestions here.
Well, I'll give you the top four asks, caveated by we haven't quite submitted these yet, but in no particular order. Actually, starting with a statutory purpose of planning would be really helpful. So understanding what are we trying to achieve. Could be sustainable communities, for example, but having a very clear statutory purpose of planning. We have achieved that through the Scottish Planning Bill, and we are now going to have a go here. That's number one. Number two, also leading the way in Scotland, is statutory chief planning officers. We did try and get it in the Lura and failed. We think that's really important because all of these things we've been talking about today are all really, really serious and important. And having the right depth of experience and seniority in local government to drive forward these matters is a really important statutory responsibility. So we'd like to see statutory chief planning officers. The third I just mentioned, we would like a national spatial plan. We feel that we could all save many days, months, possibly years of our life arguing about what needs to go where if we had the infrastructure plan, which exists nationally, with a new agricultural land use plan, with the environment and energy, and if we put it all together into a national spatial strategy, that would be exceptionally helpful at guiding development for the most sustainable locations. And last but not least, I did mention community earlier. We think having mandatory hybrid planning committees is going to be genuinely important for ensuring that the community can actively engage in this growth agenda through a fast-changing period. Some councils do it very well, but not all do it. And actually ensuring that anybody can access a planning committee, regardless of whether they're physically or not.
To define a hybrid planning committee?
Being able to join down the line as in person. Which currently is not a requirement. Yeah. So that's they may not be specific to nature and biodiversity, but they help in all of those aspects significantly.
Yeah. Anything, Mr. Kite?
I'll try not to repeat things that have been said previously, but obviously the front-loading of environmental survey and assessment that I've mentioned is one of the key things. The land use framework and what Dr. Hill was alluding to, trying to prevent this siloed thinking between government, the objectives of different government departments. So, for example, you're not paying one person to a forest land and then another person to deforest land to create biodiversity benefits or whatever. There's a lot of money is spent on directly contradictory objectives. That a land use framework can do a lot, and the planning infrastructure bill can do a lot to reconcile. I'd also say that there's still a lot more that can be done to use development as a driving force for nature recovery, whether that's in Greenbelt. A lot of the Greenbelt is biodiversity poor. It's sterile, it's intensively farmed land. If you're going to identify Greybelt sites and bring them forward, why not use that as an opportunity to fund restoration of the natural environment, and then also give people access to that so that you get the health and well-being benefits that then have knock-on effects for the NHS, etc. Those are the sorts of things I think need to be thought about.
Thank you.
Again, I won't repeat, but I think statutory consultees and infrastructure providers should be obliged to respond within a prescribed timescale during the planning process to give certainty over timescales. And also, I think we need to go over and above just looking at the new homes, and we need to be incentivising reuse, conversion and repurposing of our existing building stock.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. John Whitney.
Okay, thank you, Chair. These might be quite quick questions. Firstly, to Mr. Kite, what are your members telling you about the capacity and capability of local planners and ecologists to process housing applications?
Well, I think probably the information was well covered by Ms. Postlethwaite, but in summary, there's a recent survey has been done for the Ministry of Homes, Communities and Local Government, which showed that there were significant gaps in ecological capacity in local authorities, and that is the reason for the Green Jobs for Nature programme to try and fill that capacity.
Okay. Yeah, and a question for Ms. Neal. Are building surveyors finding that local planning authorities will not be able to cope with a significant increase in planning applications?
So I think it's important to recognise that surveying is a very broad spectrum. It's not just about building surveyors. It's about planning surveyors, environmental surveyors, and also those who are advising, for example, on the development consultancy and advice side of matters. I think that there is a delay in getting the interaction that we would like through the planning process in order to be able to deliver what's being asked in terms of the quality of the stock as well. And I think that regulations are just building regulations, and the minimum standards that are required are just as important as going through the actual planning process itself in delivering the homes and the stock that we need, and we need stock condition surveys, which is something that we're advocating for at RICS, particularly around social housing, so that we can assess the stock that we've got now and look at what can be repurposed and reutilised from the existing stock, in addition to going through for new housing development.
Thank you. Alison Taylor.
Okay, thank you. We've heard earlier that there is, in some areas, a shortage of the relevant skills, and that's hampering the smooth running of the development process, and it's also creating a development time lag. Can you each tell us briefly what your organisations are doing to attract school leavers into the profession, and is there anything the government can do to help attract young people into the careers of the future that we're going to need? Just start with Ben.
Sure. I mean, I went through a few bullet points of the things that SIME are doing to attract more people into the profession, particularly school leavers, such as finding non-degree routes into the profession, for example. We're also a very white profession. We're not a very diverse profession. You've heard about neurodiversity, and we need to do better on those fronts. I will share this, the briefing paper that we produced for the Minister for Nature. Government can obviously support all of those things. I also think there needs to be, in terms of statements and emerging policy from government concerning the natural environment, a much more positive way of framing the interaction of natural environment professionals with the delivery of planning proposals. Ultimately, SIME's members are working as hard as they can to deliver environmentally sustainable development, and that needs more support.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. Thank you. Dr. Hills, sorry.
Thank you. We are asking the government for a skills and resource strategy to address the deficit as part of the planning and infrastructure bill. And it is very much no stone unturned. There's a number of things we're doing. There are schemes working with the Local Government Association on pathways to planning, working with public practice, bringing new people in. We have recently launched with the British Chamber of Commerce a new planning scholarship to bring in a swathe of people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to go to university to work in local government, and that's working with funding partner Aviva. So we are doing everything we can, including launching a level 7 apprenticeship back in 2019. Our number one ask for the Department for Education is to provide an exemption of the Chartered Town Planner apprenticeship to the proposed changes to the level 7s. The reason we are seeking an exemption, and we completely understand why changes need to be made, but for the record, in the region of 70 to 80% of our Chartered Town Planner apprentices are in local government currently. And every single Chief Planning Officer I speak to tells me that if that apprenticeship levy goes, they will not be replacing them. This is causing local government and ourselves, and I may say the university sector at this particular moment in time, extreme concern that pipeline of students could be turned off if we do not get that exemption to the level 7 town planner apprenticeship. So above everything else, that is our current burning platform, and we are seeking urgent clarity from the Department for Education that they do not turn the tap off at this particular moment in time. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And Charlotte?
We're advocating strongly for a built environment GCSE to encourage younger members of the community to understand the roles that are within the land and built environments, and that we get the support of government to implement that. I think it's important that we don't, whilst we are doing a huge amount with Next Generation, and we would support the apprenticeship routes into the profession. We're also looking at sponsorship. We have a cross collaboration, many groups to try and show diversity and to create that view of role models to encourage people in. But it's not just about the next generation. We need to retain the talent that we've already got and encourage those in the mid-level of their careers who possibly have caring responsibilities or children or other responsibilities that they need to address to come back into the industry and to support, because we're going to lose a lot of the insight and knowledge that is there if we have an ageing demographic within our membership, and we need to encourage the transfer of that information and those skills.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming in today. Thank you. Chair.
Thanks very much. And final question for you, Dr. Hills. We've heard a lot from government about the role of planning, and I think, wonder if you feel there's been a sort of implicit suggestion in that your members are kind of blockers preventing the houses that we need in this country from being built. I just wonder if you could tell us firstly if you feel that sort of that implications are made, and what your message to government would be on behalf of your members.
So our message, and government know this well, is our members work within the system set by government. So they don't make the rules for development, government makes the rules for development. So our members are very happy to work within those rules. Indeed, they're all professionally qualified to do so, and they are there to ensure that the very important business of development is undertaken in an open, transparent and a fair way within the existing system. Our overarching message to governments, and I should say, we work across the nations here, but to the UK government, is that our members stand ready to deliver. But they need that resourcing and they need that certainty, that clarity. So yes, there's going to be changes. Yes, there's a lot of consultations on those changes at the moment. But if we carry on making changes, it provides levels of uncertainty and less reasons for finishing off a local plan or indeed starting it. So we want resourcing of the sector. We want the shopping list of things that I mentioned already in terms of status. And members absolutely stand ready to deliver on planning. Of course, we don't accept that our members are blocking any development. They are merely implementing a system that has been designed for them to implement. Planning is absolutely essential to deliver the government's growth agenda. I think we have heard that loud and clear from certainly the Chancellor of Exchequer ever since her maiden speech on day 3 of government, that planning is essential too. And so we're ready to help deliver, but it has to be resourced. And we accept that it's financially difficult to do that. So ring-fence the funding, let planning fund itself, let us resource the sector properly, and I think we can get on and deliver great things.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all of you. So Mr. Kite, Dr. Hills and Ms. Neal, thank you for the evidence we've heard. This sitting is now suspended. Order.
Thank you. Thank you very much.